Ladies and gentlemen, earlier this week, there was a disruption to the Fedwire system, and it went offline for a period of time. Now, if you've been following this show, Making Sense, then you know that over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about these interbank payment systems. And by we, I mean Jeff Snider, the head of global research at Alhambra Partners. My name's Emil Kalinowski. Jeff, we're going to talk about a disruption to the Fedwire system, but perhaps not the one that everyone's expecting, at least not immediately. We're going to go back in time. We're going to go back to 1990, August 13th. It was a Monday, and it was the first domino in a series of dominoes that would eventually lead to Fedwire disruption. Can you tell us what happened on Monday, August 13th, 1990?
Well, first, I think as you pointed out, we've been talking about these interbank plumbing issues, which I guess if we're talking about just raw correlations, conspiracy theorists might think that maybe we were the cause of the Fedwire disruption this week. Because it's kind of odd how we've been talking about Fedwire and all this stuff, and there's an interruption that just happens. But yeah, I mean, these things do happen not often, in fact, very infrequently, which is one reason why we kind of pay attention to them. And one particular episode took place in 1990. It was one of those things where it was, a combination of failures that happened in just the right order and in just the right way that led to what really was a pretty big deal. It started, as you said, on August 13th, 1990. There was a major fire. I think it was a 4-alarm fire, which if you know anything about big cities and fires, that's a huge deal, at an electrical substation in downtown New York that serviced much of Wall Street. And so on this particular Monday in August of 1990, that caused a blackout in lower Manhattan, which just, caused all sorts of problems for brokers and exchanges and all sorts of things. And for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which operates not just Fedwire, but ACH and all sorts of these electronic settlement systems too, that caused them on that Monday to switch to their backup power because, let's face it, they know about backup. They have to have backup power.
Can I just read a quote from the New York Times about that disruption on August 13th? Let's see here, quote, "The bond and foreign exchange trading slowed because broker intermediaries who supply prices for buyers and sellers were cut off. Their squawk box intercoms suddenly went quiet. Their computers no longer humming." Back to the Federal Reserve of New York.
Yes, and that was on Monday and Tuesday because the power outage, because this is a major fire at a major electrical substation, not something you can just fix overnight. So most of Wall Street, especially the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, had been on backup power for the days following it. On, I believe it was a Thursday the 16th, all of a sudden, a cooling pipe burst in the basement of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which just happened to be where these backup servers were located. Or not servers, backup power generators were located. And 2 out of the 3 power generators ended up going down, leaving the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's facility in Lower Manhattan, which was responsible for Fedwire and all these other things, suddenly without enough power to manage all of its services. So there, on Thursday, August 16th, 1990, Fedwire, it didn't experience a complete interruption, but it slowed down to the point where it was a major issue for much of the interbank plumbing of the financial system.
Now, you would think that this is a pretty big deal. The stock exchange is closed, Fedwire hiccups, but the world's attention, or even New York City's attention, wasn't on what was happening there, or perhaps maybe memory was kind of smoothed over, but by other events that were taking place. And you list several of them here. What captured our attention?
August 1990 was kind of a busy time. People who are old enough would probably remember, I think it was August 2nd, 1990, when Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. So most people's attention wasn't focused on, Fedwire and all of these issues anyway. And then there, geopolitical issues, as well as, even in the financial realm, we had the savings and loan crisis that was finally coming to a head, thing that had been building for half a decade before then. People were really concerned. Was this going to lead to another Great Depression? We have a banking system, or at least what we think is the banking system, going down. And then in August 1990, we were in the first stages of what would be an actual recession, and the first one in almost 10 years, going back to 1982. So there was lots of other stuff going on at the time this Fedwire incident happened. which, I mean, for one thing, as you pointed out, Emil, this is a serious thing. And when you go back and look into the archives and the scholarship, as far as the Federal Reserve is concerned, there's almost no mention of it. There's very little information about what happened with this. There's lots of news reports. There's quite a few that, hey, fire on Wall Street, Fedwire goes down, major interrupt. I mean, that was kind of mainstream news, but in terms of what the Fed is talking about, including the FOMC meetings, they didn't even mention it. It was as if this thing didn't happen.
And that same tone of it didn't happen or there's very little information, I'm finding, at least in this Financial Times article, about what just happened earlier this week. I'm going to read a few lines from it, and there's just very little information or gravitas or concern in this article based on what we discussed in episode 46, part 1, when it came to the Bank of New York in 1985 and how serious that was. In episode 49, part 2, we talked about the German bank Herstatt in 1974 and interbank settlement risk. So there are serious concerns when these interbank markets are disrupted. But let me read from the Financial Times what they're reporting. So this was on February 24th, and it was called Operational Error Disrupts Federal Reserve Payment System. U.S. Central Bank restores services after outage, but notifies clients of transaction backlog. The Federal Reserve suffered a temporary outage in its system for interbank payments on Wednesday, forcing it to scramble to restore operations in a vital part of the U.S. financial system. The Fed issued a statement on the trouble affecting its payment systems on Wednesday afternoon, attributing it to a mistake without offering further explanation. Quote, "A Federal Reserve operational error has resulted in disruption of service in several business lines. We are restoring services and communicating with all Federal Reserve Financial Services customers about the status of operations." The Fed staff began investigating problems with the payment system shortly after becoming aware of them at about 11:15 a.m. in the morning. Shortly before 3 p.m., the systems had resumed operating according to the U.S. Central Bank. Just not a lot of concern. It was temporary, it's no big deal. Yeah, well, episodes 46 and 49 were about temporary events too that had serious implications.
Yeah, and if we go back to the 1990 episode, one of the reasons I wanted to review it was because what is Fedwire? What does Fedwire do? It's not just, where, a couple people sending wires back and forth to each other. It's a high value interbank payment settlement system that basically almost everything runs through it. All the stuff we talked about, chips or CLS or any number of the exchanges, the Chicago Board of Trade, they all get linked to Fedwire. So Fedwire is essentially sort of the backbone of the payment processing system. And so it's not something you can just turn off and turn on. We interrupted service for a couple hours. As we talked about before, that leads to a cascading effect where the banking system says, oh crap, I don't have any way to process vital payments. And that could potentially cause enormous amounts of trouble. And in August of 1990, on August 16th of 1990, as Fedwire was interrupted, and especially government bond dealers were worrying about, okay, we don't know if we're going to be able to settle our payments requests. There was a massive sell-off in the Treasury market on the day that the Fedwire had tripped. So it was, it wasn't just Fedwire. Oh, by the way, Fedwire went down. There was all sorts of effects. And I think, the 10-year Treasury yield jumped 12 basis points on that day and then kept going for the following week, as it took almost a week, from what I gather, to really start to settle and get through the mountain of backload of payment processes and settling all these transactions, which, from what I understand from other sources, got to be about $150 billion in unsettled trades lasting over a week. I mean, that's back in August of 1990, that was a big number. So we have this massive sell-off in the Treasury market that was caused by this liquidity interruption in this vital part of the payment system.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the article that we're referencing is really an essay, and it's at Real Clear Markets, and it was posted today. Jeff, do you know what day it is? I don't know what day it is.
February 22nd or 26th.
the 26th, and it's February 2021. Why price alone does not render an asset class safe. Jeff, you bring up the fact that there was a Treasury loss, a serious loss, yields rising very quickly. And there was one this week as well, wasn't it? Quite a sharp one.
Yeah, yesterday, February 25th, the Treasury market experienced a pretty violent, nasty sell-off, especially, and really it wasn't just the 10-year or the 30-year, it was the 5-year had a really bad sell-off. And, you have to wonder, Fedwire goes down on Wednesday, very much like August of 1990. All of a sudden we have this massive interruption, or at least a massive sell-off that we can see hits the Treasury market in almost exactly the same fashion. And of course, the Federal Reserve is going to say, operational error, whatever operational error could be pretty much anything that encompasses almost anything, except for a couple of guys on the podcast talking about Fedwire for a couple of weeks in advance of it, if you're a conspiracy theorist. But, operational error could be anything. And they don't say, okay, the Fedwire went down for about 3 hours, but we do know that they extended Fedwire deadlines into the night, which meant that there must have been some further implications from that service interruption.
Now, the Fed did look at some of these moments in recent history, last couple of decades, as these kind of shocks. And you bring this up in your article. You say that in December 2003, then Richmond Fed President Jeffrey Lacker examined several similar plumbing issues. And what did they find? What did Mr. Lacker find? What was the conclusion?
Well, the point is, this Fed, as rare as they are, these kinds of service interruptions, these plumbing problems do happen. They do happen, not regularly, but they happen often enough that we have a caseload that we can look at and examine. One of them, probably the most famous episode, was September 11th, 2001, which was the focus of Jeffrey Lacker's paper in December 2003, because let's face it, it wasn't just a fire in lower Manhattan and a minor blackout. It was a complete wipeout of especially the bond dealing business, because a lot of the big bond dealers like Cantor Fitzgerald had located inside the top levels of one of the World Trade Center towers. So what was notable about all of these various events, including the 1985 Bank of New York interruption that we talked about before, was that these were interbank interruptions, therefore leading to illiquid behavior across a wide cross-section of the financial landscape, which basically said, yeah, this stuff is really important. When we have a disruption, it's gotten to the point where, especially in the 21st century, we become so dependent on them, and they've become so huge and so massive and so automated that even the potential loss of disruption can have very serious consequences.
But I think this is the underlying question and thesis of your article. But that doesn't mean there are systemic consequences. And the question you ask here, why hadn't this relatively serious payments disruption in 1990, which obviously triggered more than just apprehension in monetary and fixed income markets, make the whole system come crashing down? In certain moments, the system does suffer terribly. In others, it doesn't. So what is the explanation? Why do these anomalies, why are they sometimes just anomalies, and why are they sometimes triggers?
Yeah, and I think that's a major point that we need to understand, is that, these things happen all the time. They happened before 2008, they happen after 2008, but yet there seem to be different kinds of response or different kinds of outcomes based on whether or not they happened before or after 2008, at least in modern history. Again, August of 1990 was the period when you would have thought, with all of this stuff going on, we're heading into a recession, S&L crisis, and oh, damn, for a week, the Fedwire system caused a logjam and a massive spike in yields, and all these bad things happened.
War, serious war.
Yeah, everything. Why wasn't August 1990 the same as August 2007? What was the difference there? And I ask this question all the time, and it's about the monetary system. It's about the backbone behind all of these things. The Eurodollar system in 1990 was absolutely robust. It was bursting. It was growing. It was resilient and vibrant. It was a dynamic place. And so a Eurodollar monetary system in August 1990 said, yeah, these things are problems. They're big problems, but we got money to make money. So we're just going to keep going. That's what's different. And so you go to the post-August 2007 regime, that when you erase that kind of background behind all of these other things, suddenly anomaly that happened, that would have happened before August 2007 that nobody would have cared about, they start to become big problems, or at least bigger problems in the context of where we don't have a monetary resiliency globally. And that's really the issue here. And that's, I think, the contrast between the Fedwire in February 2021 versus Fedwire in August 1990, why we're looking at February 2021 a little bit more seriously than August 1990 is that we don't have that monetary background. In fact, when we look at what's happened over the last decade, these ups and downs, these cycles swinging back and forth between reflation and global dollar shortage, what really causes them to go back and forth is that kind of skittishness. When dealers are confronted with any sort of problem, whereas in 1990 they just ignored it and they fixed it as quickly as they possibly could and got on with themselves, in the post 2008 era they don't. They accumulate these anomalies and say, you know what, eventually there's just too many of them. We give up. We're going back into our hole. We're going to go back into risk aversion again. That's really the key here. It's not that the anomalies are happening, because they always happen, but how they're treated in the behavior of the monetary system.
And the problem and how it affects us is that our economy, our wages, our employment, our long-term outlook is attached, driven, fueled by this monetary system. Jeff, if we haven't covered a key point that you wanted to bring up, raise it now. Otherwise, we're going to travel into the future all the way to 2013 to talk about the taper tantrum in part 2.
Yeah, before we get to the taper tantrum, the last thought is, as you pointed out before, is the fact that the Federal Reserve is treating this as nothing. And so, I'm sure that the big banks and trading desks and exchanges have their direct lines into the Federal Reserve Bank of New York saying what happened and all that, but this kind of information asymmetry, which in August 1990 might not have made a difference, in post-2008 environment, it doesn't help at all. Because people are left to wonder and think, especially if you're one of these interbank participants, you're loading up payment messages on chips that is connected to Fedwire, and you think, maybe I need to be a little more careful today than I was yesterday, especially given what happened in the Treasury market, which nobody seems to want to connect to Fedwire, or at least nobody wants to explain other than, bonds have been selling off. So there's a lot of uncertainty that is unhelpful.
It really is unhelpful, Jeff. And I always wonder, why is there this belief that you need to keep these things secret? Why? Because you need to put, you're managing expectations, right? That's how you conduct monetary policy. And if you say, well, we don't know, and there's a serious problem, but we're looking into it, we're working on it, then it may suggest that you are fallible. But we're already past that. The Federal Reserve doesn't know it, but if they did, then they would realize that being upfront, transparent, as we've learned in other crises, like remember the Tylenol case, right? There was some poison. The CEO was out there. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. This is what we're doing. We'll keep you posted tomorrow. I wish that's what we were receiving from our leaders, not just in the central banking area, but more broadly, just honest transparency.
Yeah, instead they treat us like we're children who will panic at the first sign of trouble. When the irony is, it's not us who are panicking. It wasn't people who created the 2008 financial crisis. It was these very banks participating in these interbank systems. So that's the real tragic irony here.
Let's talk about panic, the taper tantrum. Let's scoot forward to 2013 in part 2.